Good morning and welcome one and all to the SALISES Spotlight series today. I want to welcome everyone who is joining us in this webinar. And we're going to take a little time to just do a quick introduction, just to also facilitate those persons who are joining us. My name is Teresa Best-Downs. I am the Episcopal Delegate for Youth for the Office of Youth Ministry. And I am also very proud to say I am alumna of the Sir Arthur Lewis Institute of Social and Economic Study. Today, we will be spotlighting a giant in his field. And if you will also notice, we have two very important persons in our space. One is Dr. St. Bernard, who will be the spotlight for today's session. And we also have with us Professor Audrey Henry Lee, who is also a director of the Sir Arthur Lewis Institute on Mona campus. And so as we gear up for this morning's presentation by Dr. St. Bernard, I want to invite Professor Audrey Lee to make opening remarks for the session. Good morning, Professor.
Yes, Ms. Teresa Best-Downs, moderator and Episcopal Delegate for Youth, Catholic Youth Commission, Archdiocese of Port of Spain, Dr. Godfrey St. Bernard, Acting Director, SALISES St. Augustine Campus, the University of the West Indies, SALISES staff and students, other UWI staff and students, ladies and gentlemen online, good morning. On behalf of the SALISES directors, staff and students at all three SALISES campus units, it gives me great pleasure to welcome you to this SALISES online spotlight feature. SALISES is the #1 social science research institute in the Caribbean, and we continue to conduct very impactful research. These spotlight features help to disseminate very important findings and stimulate critical discussions on the implication for sustainable development in SIDS. At St. Augustine, this is the 4th spotlight feature, and several have been held at Mona. We are pleased to note that the response to these spotlights has been remarkable. Research fellows learn about each other's work, and persons inside and outside of the UWI gain insights into our impactful research. I encourage all members of the audience to visit our website at salisesregional.com and follow us on all social media platforms. Join our research clusters and publish in our journal, Social and Economic Studies and Journal of Eastern Caribbean States. We also offer excellent MSc, MPhil, and PhD programs. There is an MSc in Development Studies program, an MSc in Development Statistics. We offer MPhil and PhD programs in social policy, governance and public policy, economic development policy. Dr. St. Bernard himself is the coordinator of the MSc in Development Statistics. So there's lots going on at SALISES. And I also invite all of you to continue to participate in our several public events. I want to commend Dr. Godfrey St. Bernard for implementing this spotlight feature. I'm happy that he chose a young person, and I'm learning today it's one of our own SALISES former students. I'm very proud of her, and I'm happy that she has been chosen to chair the session. Our youth are key to the attainment of sustainable development. I'm also intrigued by the title of Dr. Godfrey St. Bernard's presentation, Science, Human Population Dynamics and Development Policy Agendas in Caribbean States. And if we use a life cycle approach when examining the populations in the Caribbean, we recognize that each demographic group faces severe problems. There is already enough evidence that many of the targets that are set in the UN 2030 agenda will not be met. The current pandemic, climate change, adverse domestic economic issues, migration, brain drain, demographic transition, and global conflict have exacerbated the challenges facing all demographic groups in the Caribbean states, from the children aged 0 to 17 years to the elderly aged 60 plus. There are some very critical issues that need urgent policy attention. But the 44.42 million people living in the Caribbean are a resilient group, with thousands of them excelling and making their mark locally and internationally, in spite of many adverse conditions. I look forward to hearing Dr. St. Bernard present data and policy recommendations for the human and economic development of all demographic groups. As you all know, data is critical to the formulation, the implementation, monitoring, and evaluation of policies. W. Edwards Demong, an international statistician, warns us, and I quote, "Without data, you are just another person with an opinion," end of quote. And we all know that Dr. St. Bernard is also himself an international statistician and researcher who conducts rigorous critical data analyses, and we know that he will continue to make evidence-based policy recommendations. I congratulate him on all the impactful work that he has already done. I look forward to his presentation. Welcome again, everyone, and best wishes for an engaging and productive session. I thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Henry Lee, for your rousing introduction. I want to now take the opportunity to introduce Dr. St. Bernard. And it really is a true pleasure to be able to make this introduction. So who is Dr. Godfrey St. Bernard? He is the acting director of the SALISES at the St. Augustine campus in Trinidad and Tobago. Between 1980 and 1987, he worked as a statistician at the Central Statistical Office in Trinidad and Tobago and was responsible for the production of social and vital statistics published by the CSO. His current academic interests include problems akin to population and development, applied statistical analysis, research methodology, and evaluation research and social policy. His current research interests focus on children, youth, population policy and dynamics in the circum-Caribbean, violence prevention and safety promotion, vulnerability and resilience of small states, return migration, and the measurement of social phenomena. Dr. St. Bernard has authored numerous scholarly studies that have appeared in peer-reviewed journals, chapters in edited books, and other academic and scholarly media. He has also been the author of technical papers for several international organizations. Currently, he is the lead on two major international projects. That is the Right of Children and Youth Partnership Project, funded by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, Canada, and the Computation of Comprehensive Wealth for Trinidad and Tobago, funded by the International Institute for Sustainable Development. Dr. St. Bernard continues to coordinate the Master of Science in Development Statistics offered by SALISES, a program that he pioneered in 2008. His early days as a young statistician in CSO impressed upon him the need to develop homegrown expertise in statistical skills to inform development policy to the extent that he vowed y'all to champion and establish such a program within a formal institutional setting. And of course, we can recognize that was 2008 and this is now 2022. So the program has been going for some time. Dr. St. Bernard was the president of the Caribbean Studies Association 2012 to 2013, and he holds a PhD in social demography from the University of Western Ontario and has been recipient of two prestigious fellowships that allowed him to complete his postgraduate studies. One was from the Latin American Caribbean Demographic Center, so that's their fellowship, and that was between 1987 to 1991. And then the Population Council Fellowship, 1991 to 1992. So it is my distinguished pleasure to introduce Dr. St. Bernard as he makes his presentation this morning, and he will be presenting on science, human population dynamics, and development policy agendas in the Caribbean, small island developing states. Dr. St. Bernard.
Good morning, and Thank you very much, Chair Professor Teresa Best Downs. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Aldrey Henry Lee. I'm really pleased to deliver this lecture entitled Science, Human Population Dynamics and Sustainable Development Policy Agendas in Caribbean SIDS. And I would say that my entree into demography began in 1981, I think it was, when I was a young statistician in the Central Statistical Office in Trinidad and Tobago. And the director at the time was fishing around for someone to head the Social Statistics Division, looking for someone with a strong mathematics background. And somehow he ended up choosing me and asked me to take lead of ensuring that the social statistics in Trinidad and Tobago in an official capacity takes off. So I accepted that responsibility at a very young age. I was in my early 20s. And I started reflecting on what led me to statistics. First of all, I think it had been the fact that I was a very good student of mathematics in my secondary school life and wanted to continue doing further work in mathematics. So I did a bachelor's degree in mathematics and economics, ended up in the CSO with a keen interest in producing national income accounts, and all of a sudden ended up in social statistics. I must say that the first time I really heard about demography as a discipline, it was while being a student in St. Augustine at the UWI. And I had a mutual friend who did a course in demography, which was taught by Mr. Jack Yearwood, who was a former director of what was called ISA, now SALISES. And he taught a course in demography. And my friend, who was also an astute mathematician, said, he enjoyed it so much, the mathematics really made sense in terms of how it was applied to demography. So it was not until I got to the CSO and working in social statistics that I really encountered demography, and I discovered, firsthand, hey, here's a place that I can really make sense of all the mathematics I have learned in my life so far. It works wonders. And I decided at that point that perhaps, this is an area that is untouched. Nobody is really working and aspiring to work in the area. And I chose demography instead of national income accounts, because I felt already there were so many people working in economics, doing economics, developing capabilities in national income accounts. But where were the young demographers? And as I started to read about demography, I was really fascinated by the work of former giants in the field who worked in the region. And I'm speaking specifically of Professor George Roberts, who is dubbed the father of Caribbean demography, Miss Norma Abdullah, Mr. Jack Yearwood, and there were associations from time to time with Professor Lloyd Braffett, who was a principal of the St. Augustine campus. And these were eminent figures. And I said, I could not really see the younger folk who were around who would take the mantle and run with it. And I decided perhaps, this is what I will do. But I went into it primarily because, and please excuse me for this preamble, I went into it primarily because it was an area where I can really demonstrate the elegance of mathematics principles and use my knowledge of mathematics and see it working and coming alive. And I went into it purely for that reason. I was fascinated by all of the indices and indicators one can produce as a result of working in demography. And there were lots of, mathematical assumptions that informed a lot of the um, theoretical outcomes that we associate with demographic phenomena. And I was really fascinated by the mathematics behind all of that. So much so that my initial training in demography was what some would refer to as training in formal demography. And I remember upon my return to Trinidad, notwithstanding the fact that I had transcended from doing formal demography to social demography, I was reminded by Dr. Barbara Boland, who was then the population policy expert in the UN ECLAC based in Port of Spain. She reminded me that the demography that I will go on to do for the rest of my life will not be of the kind that I was trained in and reveled in, which was formal demography, but it was really social demography. And this brings me to where I am in terms of the science and human population dynamics, because when people ask me what I am and I say I'm a demographer, the next question, well, what does a demographer do? And I would say, well, a demographer is a scientist who studies human population dynamics and human population structure. And there are many things you can say about a scientist who does that. And insofar as I want to start by referring to demography as a science of human population dynamics, a science of human population structure. One would ask, well, I mean, why is this a science, and so on. And clearly, when we think of science, we think of, a process that produces knowledge. Of course, there are several other ways of, knowing, right? And of course, some people, they know based on hunches that they have, and they may conjure up reasons why the hunch constitutes knowledge. But when I think of knowledge, something is true. But for something to be true, something else has to be false. And if, of course, something is true or false, as the case may be, we have to embark upon critical and systemic methods and techniques to assist us in determining, in a sense, when we make propositions that constitute claims about what is true, what is false, we have to develop those methods and those systems and those techniques and use them as a basis for vouching for the truth or falsity of the propositions we make. Of course, when we talk about propositions, propositions are statements that involve concepts. Sometimes our propositions might relate to one concept. Sometimes it may relate to two or more concepts that are connected theoretically. And it means then that we have to be able to make observations on the basis of the principles and the processes that guide, the rigidity of the observations we make to come to the conclusions that allow us to make claims relating to the truth or falsity of the statements that we are making. And insofar as I talk about concepts, we can think in terms of, if one is to borrow from the biomedical sciences, we often make claims to the extent that, there's a positive association between one's blood pressure and the onset of a stroke, let's say. That statement is supported by scientific principles. And in many ways, in the social sciences, when we talk about social scientific discourses as being scientific, in many ways, we are talking about it in the same realm as we talk about, social scientific courses, discourses that may study economic institutions, social institutions, spatial institutions, in many instances, administrative institutions. It's the same set of principles, it's the same set of methods and techniques, albeit, governed by a discipline. And demography is just one of several disciplines that we can think of that has its ways and its varied approaches of embracing methods, embracing technique, conducting observations, making statements about those observations. But the other aspect of science is that, we, and I think I said some of it already, we make observations. But to make observations, there has to be some laboratory setting. And when we think about science, I mean, we think about individuals with lab coats in lab coats in their labs and their specimens, and they are making observations and doing experiments and so on in their labs, whether it's a chemistry lab, a physics lab, a biology lab, what have you. But for the social sciences, our lab constitutes households, families, economic institutions such as firms, schools, hospitals, administrative systems, environmental systems, and the list goes on. That's what our lab really constitutes. And the instruments that we use, whereas in the physical labs and so on, they have various apparati. In a chemistry lab, they use test tubes and a whole lot of other apparati. In the social setting, our laboratory would rely on instruments such as our national statistical offices with all the human resources as allied to it, a wider national statistical system, human beings that we interview and so on. So what I'm trying to say is, in a nutshell, is all of this, when you put it together, contributes to the science. And insofar as we are talking about science as a purveyor of truth, we really expect that at the end of the day, whatever results we produce are results that are as valid as possible, right? We are aiming to reduce threats to validity and maximize the prospect of hitting on that truth that exists out there. The truth exists. But how we go about that truth is in keeping with the philosophical tenets that underlie, science in that positivist kind of agenda, so to speak. So having said that, I want to move on quickly and make reference to a common theory that persists within the demographic literature, and it's really referred to as the theory of demographic transition. And it is a theory like all other theories that have to be tested, or if it isn't going to be tested, it's going to be evaluated on the basis of the research we do and refined according to what is found. But the theory of demographic transition is important, and it's really saying that if you go through time, all spaces at some point in time, once you are talking about human populations, at some point in time in history, human populations were such that death rates were high and fertility rates were high. And there were reasons for that. But then subsequently, what you found is with modern processes coming into vogue and so on, death rates began to decline, but fertility rates remained high. And as a result, you had phenomenal population growth. And that persisted in various ways until you got to another stage where both fertility and mortality rates were low because fertility eventually declined due to declining birth rates to meet, the already declined and stabilized death rates, and you would have low population growth. And then you have other stages beyond that third stage. In this diagram, you see 5 stages, but I'm really doing an abridged version of the diagram and really referring to 3 stages as have been advocated in the original conception of the demographic transition model. But there is a stage beyond the third stage where you actually have in some countries where the number of deaths may eventually exceed the number of births on an annual basis because of demographic transition outcomes and how they work themselves. And every country would eventually go through this transition, albeit at various stages. Some countries are still at stage 2. Many countries have gone through to stage 4. Many countries are now in stage 3, but it is a process that all countries would go through, albeit at different stage, in different periods, with different consequences and triggers. So I wanted to make reference to this because I think this is important in a lot of what we are going to see as we go forward. And I want to first of all start with respect to looking at population dynamics in Barbados, because I think Barbados is a very interesting country to look at in terms of population dynamics. It's one country where fertility started to decline way back in as far back as the late 60s into the early 70s, well ahead of many of the other Caribbean countries. And Barbados is also a leader in the region in terms of having what we refer to as an aging population. And Barbados has been very forthright in terms of understanding its dynamics and what it needs to do. So if you look at the next slide, you would get a quick sense of some of the demographic outcomes that have become manifest in Barbados since the middle of the 20th century. And in the early 1950s or throughout the 1950s, women in Barbados were having a maximum of 4 children. By the time we got to
Dr.
hello?
Simon, I think you just have to share your slides with us. I heard you mentioning your slides, and I know you have a presentation. So I believe you just have to switch on to sharing your slides so we can see all the good things that you are referring to.
Oh, the slides weren't shared. Oh my goodness.
Lovely.
Okay, you're seeing the slides now. Okay. Oh, I'm so sorry about that. Yes. Yes.
Great.
So, yeah, so here's where we're at. So in terms of the fertility rates, we can see that in the early 1950s, women in Barbados were having as many as 4 children. And by about the late 1970s, they were just about the point where Barbadian women had hit replacement fertility levels, 2.2 thereabouts. They were having just about 2 children. Their replacement fertility rate is a TFR of 2.1. And then we can see that since then, Barbados has continued having fertility trajectories way below, well, somewhat below replacement level in the vicinity of 1.9, 1.8. What this means is that if Barbados continues with this kind of fertility pattern, it could eventually run the risk of having its population decline, having hit a threshold at some point in time. At the same time, we can see over the years, much more favorable outcomes with respect to the mortality experience of Barbadians in the Barbadian population. And we can see life expectancy for both men and women increasing from the high 50s in the 1950s up until this, and by the middle of the 2010s thereabout, we are talking about, life expectancy in excess of 70 years and so on. Infant mortality rate, you can see the trend here, but as we speak, the infant mortality rate and the child mortality rate, the infant mortality rate is really the risk of dying in the first year of life. The child mortality rate is the risk of dying in the first 5 years of life. And this is really saying, out of every 1,000 live births in Barbados, we expect 10 of them to die before their first birthday. And out of every 1,000 persons who were born in the last 5 years, we expect 11 to die before they attain their fifth birthday and so on. So this is giving you a sense of the interpretation. But you can see generally the kind of figures we are talking about for Barbados. And then, of course, Barbados is a country that lost population consistently through the period. But since 2000, there seems to be somewhat of a gain in its population through migration forces and so on. So that gives you a quick sense of what is going on there. In terms of the next slide, you can see the population sizes of Barbados historically, and you can see where Barbados is at today in terms of its population size. In 2010, the census showed it to be 277,821. And and as we speak, Barbados's population could be in the vicinity of 290. Now, going forward, you can see here what is projected for Barbados. And clearly, you can see sometime between 2020 and 2035, Barbados is expected to actually hit a maxima in terms of its population size. So I do not think, in the history of humankind, if things continue the way they are continuing right now, uninterrupted, that Barbados will ever experience having a population in excess of 300,000 persons, right? But certainly by 2040 onward, Barbados could certainly expect to see declining population sizes. And by 2060, the population of Barbados would be what it perhaps was just around the beginning of the new millennium. And of course, you can see how that is distributed when you look at the various age groups. The age group that is consistently increasing is the elderly, those 65 plus, right? And you can see that, from 2025 onward, you're going to have more persons 65 plus than you have under 15. And you can see too, in terms of the working population, that Barbados's working population 25 to 64, in terms of that 25 to 64 age group, you can already see some declines. And that is a worrisome thing in terms of what is called the demographic dividend and the prospect of, having a working population that can generate production, generate revenue sufficient to support those populations like the elderly and the child populations who are largely dependent on the inputs of those who are of working age. And to the extent that that becomes threatened, eventually that could put serious strain on the ability of the country to support its peoples and to support its subpopulations who would be in need. So therein lies a serious problem already. And then, of course, you can see with that kind of decline that is projected with respect to Barbados's population, you can see by 2060, by 2050, a quarter of the Barbadian population will be 65 years and over. Whereas when we go back to the beginning of the new millennium, we were just talking about 1/10 of the Barbadian population. So again, serious work has to be done to ensure and to overcome these kinds of challenges. So again, to say a bit, what are some of the implications? There are certainly implications for the labor market in terms of, declining numbers of young persons coming into the labor market. Of course, given what's happening with aging populations, you're going to have much more persons exiting the labor force and so on. And of course, Barbados could expect, its labor force to decline at some point in time from 2025 on 2035 onward if serious initiatives are not taken to deal with such issues. In terms of health issues, certainly non-communicable diseases would increase, and I mean, and that would lead to many more responsibilities in terms of providing for health and social care as the population ages and so on. And I'm talking about a population that might not have been engaging in self-care as it should. So it would take some time, but this has lessons for younger populations and how we cater to the health needs of younger populations. So for example, in our school populations, are we embarking and making provisions with respect to the diet, and in particular the ingestion of sugars and so on in our diets? Or is it that we are making provision to ensure that, you know, recreation and physical activity becomes a major part of school curricula to get children in the habit of being busy in terms of moving around and becoming active? And of course, there are infrastructural issues as well for Barbados in terms of, you know, the supply of housing, right? Those are issues that are going to arise. And I'm saying all of this because what all of this is leading to is what the Barbados Prime Minister has been alluding to for quite some time, and really advocating for the fact that Barbados may have to do like other Caribbean states, such as Cayman Islands and Turks and Caicos Islands, and embark upon a process of managed migration where Barbados will now be seeking to attract foreigners to its shores, and at the same time woo Barbadians who live overseas to return to Barbados and make a contribution, and also, you know, embark upon strategies and policies that would dissuade Barbadians from migrating, but rather staying home and contributing. So once this kicks in and so on, there are going to be prospects in a country such as Barbados in terms of, you know, housing needs. If it is you are attracting persons to come into Barbados, what kind of housing provisions are you making for these people as they come into Barbados? And that is going to be an issue. Of course, there's going to be concern with respect to urban sprawl and the impact it would have on public transport and overtaking land that has been reserved for arable farming, among others. Barbados being a tourism culture, what are the implications for the coastal zones and the marine habitats and those kinds of things, you know? So those are issues that are going to be important. At the end of it all, in terms of social policy imperatives for Barbados, there's certainly going to be a need to create a smart labor force. And I'm saying all of this because implicit in this discussion is the importance of, you know, embarking upon what one would refer to as a sociological imagination that has been popularized by C. Wright Mills way back in the middle of the 20th century. And we have no alternative. We cannot continue operating our labor markets the way we have operated our labor markets in the past. We have to be in tune with, you know, the whole process of historical materialism, which I would speak to as we go ahead, and recognize the importance of technology. So we have to create smart labor forces. I mentioned managed migration in a country such as Barbados, but all of this has to take into account questions about, is there an optimal population size? What is that optimal population size? I know in the context of Barbados, based on some of the work that has been done in Barbados and some of the insights I have had based on some of my own research, if let's say the total fertility rate in Barbados had remained at 2.1 at the point in time when it began to shift in the early 70s, right now, Barbados would have had about 400,000 persons as opposed to the 290,000 we are basically seeing. And what is an optimal population size for Barbados is a critical question that has to be taken into account in that trust toward a managed migration and how it is going to be implemented as you bring in persons. Of course, another policy would be promotion of pro-family ideals sort of resembling pro-natalist policies. But I think, you know, with the kind of decline we have seen in fertility levels And given that, gender movement, the feminist movement, and gains in terms of the prescriptions around issues of gender, I think those have largely been responsible for a lot of the decline we have seen in fertility. And as that gains momentum, I think there will be severe resistance in terms of women and couples actually going back to that ideal where you had larger families in excess of the 2.1 TFR arrangement that persisted in the prior to the 1980s and so on in many Caribbean countries. So I think, there are some challenges as far as that is concerned. So I've looked at Barbados, and I now turn my attention to Trinidad and Tobago and looking at traffic congestion as a population problem. And in terms of commuting, in terms of the traffic congestion and how it relates to population, commuting is a way of life in almost every society we can think about. And we can start thinking about, one's material and spiritual well-being. And people have to commute because they have to work, they have to go to school, they have to buy food, they have to get food, obtain food. And when we think in terms of historical materialism and the link between history and how human beings supported themselves in terms of their basic needs, we could think, about, hunting and gathering societies. We can think about feudal society in Europe. We can think about capitalist societies. And in a Marxist sense, they were also making reference to the fact about that transition from capitalist societies to socialist societies. All of this having to do with, the relationship between human beings and different human beings and the different modes of production, who owns the different modes of production, and how the mode of production and who owns those mode of productions are conceptualized, and so on. So with the passage of time, of course, as we go from capitalist societies to more postmodern societies where there's greater specialization, and I say greater specialization and interests evolve in different directions, in keeping with Durkheim's notion of mechanical and organic solidarity, we have to ask ourselves, how do our transportation systems change in response to these kinds of movements? And as transportation systems change and the means to commute change, I think you are also going to see implications that manifest themselves in terms of the magnitude of population growth and what that magnitude means for urbanization in some settings. But generally speaking, commuting is an instantaneous human event, and it is something that, once you are human and once you have that capacity to move, whether you are moving by walking, whether you are moving on horseback or in a donkey cart or riding a bicycle, taking a bus, jumping into your automobile, even taking a yacht, some watercraft or what have you, you are moving from one spatial point to another spatial point. And you are moving there because you are seeking to satisfy your own material base in terms of accessing goods and services and things of that nature. This diagram, this chart just gives you a quick sense of, Port of Spain and San Fernando and the drastic changes in the population size of Port of Spain and San Fernando over the years. Port of Spain, of course, has lost a lot of population. And again, this is where sociological imagination comes in, because I had a fix to this, a roadway, the Churchill-Roosevelt Highway in Trinidad back in the 1960s with one vehicle on it, a single lane highway, and lots of greenery around and so on. I did not post the picture because there might have been copyright infringements, but it says something about, what the Churchill-Roosevelt Highway would have looked like in the 1960s. I can remember it. I am old enough to remember it. And that is what it looked like. It was just a two-lane highway and very few cars on the road. Today, if you see the Churchill-Roosevelt Highway, there are about 8 to 10 lanes and there are vehicles all over the place. And those vehicles just didn't come there. They are there as a result of, population size changes and growth and so on. And I will make that point. Not only that, there was also another picture of Port of Spain, the main street in Port of Spain, Frederick Street. There were lots of cars parked on the roads, lots of bicycles. So bicycles were the mode of transport back in those days and this was around the mid part of the 20th century, and lots of people walking. And I would believe that, I would think that most of the persons in Port of Spain in those days would have been residents of Port of Spain and close surrounding areas, because commuting between different parts of Trinidad and Tobago would not have been what it is today by virtue of having access to motorized transport and so on. And then, of course, there were a number of events that took place over the years in terms of, the post-World War baby boom, right, which contributed to tremendous growth in the population during the 60s, 70s, and 80s. But by the 90s, that baby boom generation had run its course, and we started to see the decline in the population and so on. And those things have implications too, because I would think as that prey goes through the digestive system, it reaches different points in the digestive system at different points in time. And you can see that in terms of those who are likely to engage in activities that would require commuting activities and so on, and commuting engagements, you would be talking about, persons of a particular age. So as you follow that baby boom generation, you can perhaps begin to understand why there was this massive increase in the number of motorized vehicles we have had in the country, not only for personal private use, but also for public use as well, in terms of people investing in motorized vehicles to provide commuting services and so on. We had in Trinidad and Tobago rapid population growth and urbanization due to that baby boom generation. We had also, the railway system that was disbanded, the oil boom of 1974 to 82, highway construction to cater for the increased demand for commuting, structural adjustment. We had a foreign used car market, oil and gas boom again in 1994 to 2008. And all of this in tandem with the depopulation of Port of Spain and so on. So again, there are a number of things. There has been a vast literature on this issue in a Trinidad and Tobago context in the earlys. I mean, during the 70s and 80s, there was some work being done, some more contemporary literature by people in the form of Dr. Townsend and Furlong and Miss Morris Allen. I mean, these are people who have done, some of Trevor Townsend in particular, have done a lot of work in this area. And also, there has been an international literature out there. So when you look at the population of Trinidad and Tobago, you can see that right as of the last census, we were at 1.3 million. And you can see the changes, the population boom, and how it has been moving through the system. And again, like in the case of Barbados, we can see what is happening to the Trinidad and Tobago population in terms of what we will look like. In fact, somewhere between 2020 and 2035, we are likely to hit a maxima. We may hit a maximum of about 1.4 million, and that would be it. Other than that, the population size will go right back down. And we can see the same sort of thing happening in Trinidad and Tobago that we saw in Barbados, and some of the same explanations for Barbados could apply in the context of Trinidad and Tobago. What we could see again consistently is a growing population size of those 65 plus, among other things that are happening here. And these two these graphs really show in terms of population projections, what is happening in terms of, different population projections. When you do population projections, it's really it's really an attempt to model mathematically what is likely to be the size of your population in the future, given what you know now. We don't have a crystal ball to know what the population size will be in 2040 or 2050, but we know what has happened in the past. We understand critically in all of this demographic theory as it relates to fertility, mortality, and migration, the main pillars of demographic change theory. We do understand those theories. We have a sense as to what are some of the population policy prescriptions and other social policy prescriptions that have been established in countries, and we can make various assumptions, a sort of medium assumption, a constant assumption, a high assumption, a low assumption, to cater for the kind of variability that may occur as we continue making statements about, population size change. And what you would see is whether we are talking about the high variant, the low variant, or the medium variant or the constant variant, the population size is slowing down. In fact, the ones we saw before, constant and medium, they look like this, only that the level is different. They would be somewhat higher. And we can see that whether we are talking about the total population or the population 15 to 79 years old, the blue line, what we can see is we are at a point in time where it is just about plateauing, and then it will start declining. But even when it starts declining, it will not, by 2050, 2060, be anything lower than what we had seen for about around the year 2000 or in the late 1990s. The difference, of course, would be the composition of the population in terms of the aging phenomenon and what that really means for what is going on. Now, what you see here are some figures looking at the number of motor cars in Trinidad and Tobago over time from 1960 up until about 2010. Now, this decline here in 1988 to about 1993, and some of my colleagues in transport and in particular have queried these figures, and they found that, the drop was somewhat precipitous and we couldn't really account for it. But I would think that this was a period when we would have witnessed somewhat of a decline in the number of vehicles in Trinidad and Tobago. To what extent it declined is absolutely critical. I don't think we have the figures to support it, but certainly those of you who are alive and well in Trinidad and Tobago today can account for this precipitous increase in the number of motor cars on the road in Trinidad and Tobago. And again, in keeping with the science, in keeping with trying to use the science to make, to provide logical bases for plausible claims that we can accept as, approximating truth, if not telling the truth. We can think in terms of models where level of motorization can be linked to population size, and you're looking specifically at different characteristics of the population. So it's different subpopulation sizes you are looking at. And of course, we cannot rule out real output as an economic variable, because I think these are two main components that are correlated with one another and at the same time impacting level of motorization. And once we can actually obtain the reliable data, the valid data from the laboratories to support this kind of work to stimulate, statements around this, I think we would be a step further in enhancing the understanding. Now, this goes a bit further, looking at two censuses in Trinidad and Tobago and accounting for areas where you had aging populations, and the urban areas of Port of Spain, San Fernando, Diego Martin in particular. Those are perhaps the oldest communities in Trinidad and Tobago. Many of the other communities are substantially younger. And we can see this when we look at this figure here, looking at the percent 65 plus 2000, percent 65 plus 2011, based on those two censuses and the areas that I flagged earlier. Of course, the areas that are substantially older, those are the areas that really stand out here. Diego Martin, San Fernando, Port of Spain, and so on. And those older areas, of course, what we would expect is a correlation now between the older populations and the prospect of, population size decline in terms of intercensal growth. And you can see the decline and the extent of the decline as you come in this column here. Most of the other areas are in growth mode, and it's because they have younger populations. And these are instrumental because what these can do is really help you now, because what I'm really advocating for, if we are to really deal with this issue of, the transportation problem and how it is precipitated by what we know about population dynamics, it's not just knowing what is the size of the population of Trinidad and Tobago only. We need to know something about what's going on at the level of the municipalities as well. And this kind of information is really important in terms of the assumptions that we make, in terms of how we go forward, making statements about the population and so on. So what are some of the major insights? Of course, one thing I can say is that the motor vehicles have already flooded the roadways, and they will be here for the long haul. Don't expect by 2040, 2050, we would be anyway better off in terms of the number of motor vehicles on the road. Of course, we have to start thinking about, the new technologies and what is going to happen in the context of, we keep talking about, cars precipitated that are powered by electricity and things like that. We have to start thinking about all those kinds of developments and what they mean. What is the new technology associated with the automotive industries and so on? We have to think about that. But as long as we look at what's happening with our populations come 2040, 2050, even 2060, I do not think, there's going to be much movement in terms of the number of motor vehicles on the road. And we will have to find creative ways to facilitate commuting within our confines and physical land space and that sort of thing. Of course, projected population sizes sustained at post-20th century levels up until at least 2050. All of this will continue despite, the fact that, there is population aging taking place, and motor vehicle usage, of course, will be sustained at that high level. I mentioned the importance of us using our sociological imagination, and what this really calls for, as I've been saying, is population projections by age, sex, and municipality. And based on the analysis that I just did earlier, that can certainly help. Now, I think this is particularly important because what you see here is a set of arrows where, again, we are talking about population demographics, sex, age, education characteristics, employment characteristics, origin and destination, whether it's single, multiple, what have you. You go on to find out whether these persons are commuters. If yes, they are commuters, what is their mode of transport? You have all the different modes of transport. What is the peak periods for their travels? What is the purpose of their travels? So once you are a commuter, we need to know all of these things. And even when we have your mode of transport, we still want to know what is your peak period for traveling. We want to know if given your peak period for traveling, what is the purpose of your travel? Given the mode of travel, what is your purpose of traveling, and so on. Now, why this? You would not believe, when I was a young statistician in the CSO in the early 1980s, the 1980 population and housing census specifically asked a question about this particular issue that we are looking at here. And I looked at it and I thought about it even back then as a young demographer. I'm saying, what an important question. And up until this day, I have seen no one make use of any of this information in terms of, what it would mean for planning. And perhaps had that been done at that stage, we would not be in the mess we are in today. Because where all of this is heading, we wait until, you know, we have a problem on our hands to try to fix it and expect results tomorrow. It does not work so. These kinds of outcomes that are linked to population dynamics are generational. And you will have to wait for a number of years to see real change taking place. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not advocating a situation where you just have to throw your hands up in the air and give up. But there are certainly, you know, short-term measures that can be embarked upon to perhaps ease the burden, right? But certainly not making use of this data. And since that census, I've never seen it appear in any other census. I know we are talking about doing another census in Trinidad and Tobago sometime in 2023, hopefully. I hope the authorities that behave this serious about transportation and the link between population dynamics and traffic congestion on the roadways, that they make sure a question like this is inserted in the questionnaire so that decisions can be made based on the kind of analytics that could be done to inform the way forward, especially given what I've been saying, come 2040, 2050, 2060, the number of cars on the roadways ain't going to be much different, right? All things remaining the same. So having said all of that, really and truly need for continuous population projections at national and spatial levels, micro household surveys of commuting behavior and pattern, perhaps every 5 years, right? This is important in terms of education planning and school placement, and in terms of economic development and where you cite specific industries. I have heard people in the planning and planning in this country, you know, talking about, well, we'll put this kind of industry here and we'll put this kind of industry here without taking into account who are the people that, you know, thrive in these industries. How do you cater to the needs of, you know, locally based populations? What will these locally based populations look like in years to come? You have to start at that level, you know, in terms of, well, this is what it's going to look like given the projections we are seeing. And based on what it's going to look like, then we can start having a dialogue with the people who are there now in terms of what they want for their space to improve their livelihood within their specific communities and things like that. And these are the things we have to do. Of course, there are other implications in terms of criminological insights, the fear of crime, and so on, maintaining law and order, because commuting is integrally connected with, you know, criminological outcomes and criminological manifestations in this country. People are afraid to travel, dependent on what means they use to travel and so on. So in doing all of this, we have to fix crime as well, right? Workplace practices and so on. We have to take those things into account in terms of nurseries and so on in the workplace. I always remember in 1990, I went to the Population Council in New York. They had funded me to finish my PhD. And one of the officials there in 1990, when I went to her, we started chatting and she told me, well, you know, I just had a young baby and so on, and we were talking about the young baby. And at a certain point, she said, well, if you would excuse me for a while, I have to go to the nursery to attend to the young baby. The baby was on the job. And the workplace had made provisions to facilitate care for that young baby on the job and so on. I don't know in our context if we have come to that kind of realization that perhaps these are the kinds of things we have to do. And all of this is part of population policy that we have to think about. I want to go on now to talk about Montserrat, right? Population and development policy in Montserrat responding to a natural disaster, right? And I talk about this because, again, I was in Montserrat not too long after the natural disaster there. I remembered, you know, doing some work with the authorities there, because one of the critical things they wanted to do is to have like a population situation analysis done to embark upon a population policy to repopulate the place after the volcanic eruption. And you can see here a map of Montserrat, and this gray area, of course, is the exclusion zone where it's really not accessible by the public because of all of the destruction wreaked upon Montserrat by the volcanic eruption, right? And these were areas that were principally the habitable areas of Montserrat prior to the volcano. So the 5,000 people who live on Montserrat today live in the green area. And Braids has become this somewhat of the administrative capital. So what you see here in these photos really reflect, what Montserrat was like, before the volcanic eruption. You can see the hills and the town of Plymouth, and you can see the war memorial and the building next to the war memorial still standing before the eruption. What you see here, where the cursor is, you see just the top of the war memorial and the top of this building here, buried under the rubble that came down as a result of the volcanic eruption. So it tells you about the extent of the destruction. And of course, here what you see are some of the villas that are in the exclusion zone, some mansions and villas that were on the mountainside. And I remembered I stayed on this side, and this is on the border between where you can live and where you cannot go. And these are some of the villas. So it tells you something about, about what went on there. And I always remember, being in SALISES and in Mona, and there's a lady there, a very prayerful lady. Her name is Dorrit Mullins, and she's always very inspirational and encouraging. And one day she said to me, "Doc, where there's hope, there's life. And once there's life, there's hope." And I said to her, what a powerful statement. Perhaps one of these days I'm going to use that statement. Yeah. One of these days I'm going to use that saying. I'm told by my officer I'm out of time. So I'm just going to try to wrap up in a kind of way, because I think I've said a lot already. I'm just going to complete this one on Montserrat and end it here. I had something else to do, but I would just leave that out. Yes, so in terms of her statement, she's very inspirational and so on. And I told her I'm going to talk about it because I really think in the case of Montserrat, her statement was very apt. And you can see the population trajectory again in Montserrat historically. And the country, the island actually had its maximal population maxima in 1946, just over 14,000. And what was interesting is that, I mean, the country was such that, everything, it was heaven on earth. It was a paradise up until 1979, when it experienced a major hurricane that really flattened it. And just when they were about to rebound from the hurricane and take off, on came the threat of the volcano, and the rest was history. So in 1991, there were 10,000 persons on Montserrat, heading to 11,000. And since then, the population size has been reduced to about 4,000. So again, you can see in terms of the live births and so on, in terms of the deaths, Montserrat is a country where in many instances, the number of deaths exceeded the number of births, and that happened in the post-volcanic era, because of course, what really happened was a case of, many of the young persons leaving, lots of older persons were left behind. And in countries where you have a high proportion of persons being elderly, what you are going to see is an elevation in the number of deaths, because older persons are at greater risk of dying. And that's a demographic fact. There are certain demographic sensibilities that prevail, that ought to prevail in all of social sciences. And what that does, in addition to declining fertility, aging populations, increase in the number of annual deaths, what that contributes to is declining population growth. So Montserrat experienced declining population growth in many ways. And you can see that the population of Montserrat hitting a low of just about 3,000 in 1998. It recovered to about 4,681 in 2004, around the time that I was in Montserrat. And since then, it has never really moved significantly. Clearly, migration has to be the main trigger, the main lever to facilitate any semblance of population growth in Montserrat. Of course, what you see here are a number of, post-crisis observations that really negatively impacted the social fabric of Montserrat. And Montserrat, again, in its thrust to recover, really had established three social development policies. And in these social development policies, quite apart from resuscitating the domestic economy and enhancing human production, impacting governance systems, a major pillar of these social development policy was population. And because without population and without managing the population dynamics, all of the other social policy prescriptions, whether they be economic, human, governance related, what have you, would all amount to naught. So in terms of more recent trends, what one can say is that since 1999, the population of Montserrat had begun to increase due to immigration, right? Foreign nationals and return of Montserratians on the island. With the onset of the new millennium, of course, aging processes on Montserrat seemed quite evident, and the proportion of persons aged 65 years and over actually stabilized at around 16% in 2001. Fertility levels, however, continued to be low and below replacement level. They were more favorable and improving movements with respect to mortality status on the island. Migration was certainly a wild card to be manipulated, and positive growth on the island really was necessary in order to stimulate the kind of growth. Now, I show you this here because these are some projections I had done back in 2004 for Montserrat, because while I was there, I was operating on the dictates of authorities there that by 2007, they wanted to have 7,000 people on Montserrat and were already planning for, the prospect of having 7,000 people on Montserrat. I did all the population projections and I told them by 2020, you perhaps would not even have 5,000 people on Montserrat. That was in 2004. These were the projections that were done. And clearly you can see, based on my projections, I wasn't too far off, because in 2016, what they found was that they had 5,055. What I got was this figure here. Right? Again, following the scientific principles associated with doing population projections and advising. And as we speak, the population of Montserrat has not really changed much. There are things I can say about the different population groups who were in Montserrat, what they were doing, and so on, based on some of the data that were collected and what all of that really means, right? I don't think I can go into that because I'm beckoned to finish. What I would say, though, is that by way of the future, Montserratian authorities should really facilitate increasing levels of positive net migration. If deemed essential, they should also embrace initiatives that would facilitate increased levels of fertility. That's one thing they should do. Of course, increasing the magnitude of positive net migration stands out as a desirable option in facilitating increases in Montserrat's population. That's a must, and I think it is something that they understand. Montserratian authorities have to establish a medium for retaining its native domiciled population in Montserrat and attracting others who are domiciled overseas, and that is Montserratians. And by 2016, right, what you would have found is that the two most favorable projections that had been done, really showed that, the size of the elderly population in Montserrat would tend to be about 20% or so and stabilize around that level. Of course, there are some options for Montserrat in terms of, perhaps one can consider the space to be a haven for geriatric care, in terms of that being a principal occupation in the eyes of Montserratian authorities. There are prospects perhaps for offshore university programs and international geriatric communities and so on. So at this point, I think rather than go through all of the other things that I wanted to do, I think I will stop here. And all I would say is that we have to be, more proactive, and we have to really trust the science that is associated with demographic principles in terms of their implications for advancing the cause of social policy. So I would stop here in the interest of time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Bernard. I want to use one of the comments that was in the chat. It's really been a feast in terms of the amount of information provided. And there are a few major questions that have been posed, all of them around the role that demography, especially formal demography, plays in the social policy context. So I'll just pull 3 questions quickly, and if you could respond, and I'm going to have to keep you to time with the response. Question: to what extent should the trends identified for Trinidad and Tobago and Barbados and the wider Caribbean in relation to population size be a cause for concern in terms of pressure on existing resources? Another one related: based on the information and research, does Trinidad and Tobago and the wider Caribbean need to reprioritize its developmental objectives? And in the same vein, I think we also got a question on would the cost of living impact on fertility rates and be a significant contributor to demographic issues in various countries? So they're all in the same vein. So I'm giving you just about 1.5 minutes to respond to these 3 questions, Dr. Simonan.
Well, there are 3 questions, but they seem to be quite a mouthful. But I'll take the one about the cost of living and fertility, because it ties into a point that I wanted to make and I didn't have the time to make. What we have observed clearly is that across the region, it doesn't matter which Caribbean country you are looking at, fertility rates have been declining, and many of them have already hit way below replacement level fertility. What is interesting about fertility decline at national levels is that the decline is not as pronounced when you do a class analysis of, fertility decline. The fertility decline is largely among women in the upper echelons of the society. But as you go to the lower socioeconomic status groups, you find that across time, fertility has not declined, or it has declined at much slower rates. And while we have not done fertility surveys in the region since the 1980s, and we need those surveys to really understand these dynamics, we need those surveys if we are to really make adequate prescriptions about, how we reverse the reduction in fertility. We need those fertility. But based on whatever available data available, whether it's from living standards measurement surveys in countries like Jamaica, Trinidad and Tobago, and even in the context of Montserrat, Eddie Banks back in 1987 made the point that, yes, the fertility decline is taking place, but not much of it has taken place among the lower socioeconomic status groups. So what this means is, I'm not sure that the cost of living is really affecting, those in the socioeconomic status groups in terms of their decisions to reduce the number of children that they have. It's not having that kind of impact. And perhaps that is what is the factor driving those in the middle and upper groups. Now, what that means in terms of, the overall well-being of our societies, yes, as you go across countries, the number of live births annually is declining. But because the majority of these births are coming from women who happen to be in the lowest socioeconomic status groups in society, and given all the structural arrangements that impact negatively on their poverty status, their education status, their living arrangements, what have you, you have increasingly larger proportions of the of that declining number of live births being live births born in those kinds of settings. So when I hear people, in Trinidad and Tobago talking about, COVID-19 and, learning loss and the impact of learning loss in terms of children's performance in the C examination, I think we had been seeing, inferior performances in C examinations for some time now. And it's largely a function of that you have increasingly larger proportions of your cohorts that are coming of age who are born in settings where they were compromised long before COVID came, right? And COVID and the learning loss associated with COVID is just a function of what had been happening all along. So I think, if I'm not missing, I hope that, that explanation could help in terms of treating with some of the other questions that would have been asked. So please let me know if I did address that particular concern, and if I omitted something that was very important in one of the other questions that was asked, let me know and I'll deal with it.
So I want to direct you, because I think many people are commenting about the importance of a kind of a demographic sensibility in policy making. So there are a couple questions related to that and comments related to that. So I would like to pose the question in a different way. To what extent do you believe that we are actually engaging a demographic sensibility or literacy in our policy processes and in the development agenda of our Caribbean states?
Okay, I'm going to make a statement here that might appear to be somewhat controversial. And I don't know if you remember, in Trinidad and Tobago, we are aware of, the issues around Venezuelan immigration, the Venezuelans who have fled to Trinidad and Tobago. And at some point in time, there was a registration process. And that registration process, I suppose, had a number of objectives, one of which was perhaps, to give us a sense as to how many Venezuelans are in Trinidad and Tobago. That to me was a census exercise. And I don't think the authorities that ever touched or mentioned the engagement of an organization such as the CSO in an exercise such as that one. So clearly, somewhere along the line, the demographic sensibility is missing. And up until now, I don't think we are none the wiser as to how many Venezuelans ever came to Trinidad and Tobago and how many are still here, right? Had we done a proper census, that could have only been done if the persons orchestrating that exercise had some respect for demography, had some respect for demographic sensibilities, had some respect for what is involved in taking a census. So we erred miserably there, right? And that is just one of a number of other places where that happens. I can also say something else. I mean, in terms of demographic sensibilities, and here is where I have to really congratulate and put in a big plug for the Department of Sociology, Social Work, and Psychology on the Mona campus of the University of the West Indies. Demography as a discipline, if it is one place where it was taught, it was there. And it was taught there because of the presence of Professor George Roberts, who has been dubbed the father of Caribbean demography. And up until today, I think there are some flagship courses within the department that are taken by students across a whole range of departments on the Mona campus, whether they're doing medical sciences, whether they're in psychology, whether they're in economics. It is almost like a foundation course, right? And it is only in such settings that, you can begin to bring that demographic sensibility to bear upon social science discourse, right? I have not seen it anywhere else, right? I mean, it pains me when, I go to a conference and I see an economist talking about a link between economics and fertility behavior. And there's no reference to demographic theory in the presentation. And perhaps the economist never thought it worthy enough to perhaps have a chat with a demographer to find out, well, what are some of the theories that, inform variation in fertility outcome? And there are several, even including theories in economics, which the economist would not have mentioned. So I think, this explanation, I hope it does help in terms of making the point that you asked in response to the question.
I think it does, because we did have someone who asked the question about whether or not you were happy with the status, I'm just paraphrasing here, with the quality of data in the national system. So I think you've answered the question in a sense. You've given your opinion about the status of national statistics. But I want to take, there's a really interesting question that I want to take from Wendell Wallace about, do you see the connection between population trends and criminality? I think this is a really interesting question. I'd like to make sure you answer.
Okay. Now, again, this is where science, demography embraces science. For all my academic life, I have been trying to ask myself the question, how does demography help us to explain the proliferation of crime and violence in contemporary society in Trinidad and Tobago? What provides the explanation for that? And this is going beyond access to guns and all the reasons why one would have access to guns, and hence the high prevalence of gun-related crime and homicide and that sort of thing, right? And it takes me back to 1972, right? Why 1972? 1972 was the year when we implemented the junior secondary school and senior secondary school system. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that it is these kids that were responsible or had any bearing on what eventually happened, right? I think it was a case of a newly independent government who suddenly recognized, you know what? Hey, we have a baby boom generation to educate. And I was one of those who did common entrance in the early days, when perhaps less than 20% of the kids who did the exam would get into a secondary school. And a whole set of others would be told, well, you failed the exam. Notwithstanding the fact that they perhaps got 60, even 70%. but the 60-70% was enough to put them in the 20% that will get into schools, right? So to break that, a whole set of schools were built to accommodate this massive reserve army of students who needed to be educated, and you place them in these schools on a shift system basis. So some went to school in the morning, some went to school in the evening. Nobody ever stopped to figure out, well, who will care for those who went to school in the morning and where they would end up and so on. And I always felt that, no one ever did any serious study of that. And, who would have been the peer, who would have experienced that? What has become of these persons who experienced that experiment, right? What of their children? How many children did some of these young girls and young men go on to have? What became of those children, right? And where they are today. And I think, in many ways, what we are seeing today could have its roots back then. But nobody ever thought that, perhaps, we could perhaps do that kind of retrospective inquiry to see if there was a link between that and what is happening now. And I think, there has to be something to say about, the generations that evolved as a result of being offspring of some of the kids who might have, been the victims of that experience to achieve universal secondary education, but somehow it was an experiment that went wrong in so many different ways, right? Because at the point in time, we couldn't handle it. And I'm really saying, that now that we know better, I think if we want to really ensure that we fix 2040, 2050, 2060, we have to start now embracing the kind of sensibilities, bearing in mind the projections and what these projections will mean in terms of what is likely to happen. And believe you me, I can tell you, notwithstanding the scientific notions that I hold so dear to, I believe in self-fulfilling prophecies, right? You set a target and you work toward that target. Yes, the target is a moving target, but the only way you will know that the target is moving is because you are continuing doing what you have to do in terms of digging deep in the trenches and doing the work and ensuring that, you have sustainable processes to ensure that somewhere along the way, somebody doesn't drop the bag of marbles, right?
Well, we have one more question that I would want to pose, but I think you've given us the kind of setup in your response a moment ago that helps to answer the question, and that's from Lionel Remy, and I believe that person is known to you. Going forward, should both demography and epidemiology be included in the St. Augustine Campus UE curriculum in social work, sociology, psychology, and education?
I would say a huge yes to that, right? I know that the St. Augustine campus within the Department of Behavioral Sciences, they have a course in demography and the book Population Studies 1, Population Studies 2. And I taught it, right? And of course, our chairperson, she did that course back then when I taught it. And I have seen many persons who actually read the course back then, gone on to do wonderful things with their lives and so on. But somewhere along the line, I don't think it was a course that was offered beyond the sociology department. Persons could take it if they wish, if they choose to do it. But I think what happened in Mona is that, you know, they went out of their way to establish the importance of demography and ensuring demography, the sensibilities of demography prevail in the social sciences. So you find you could be in the economics department, you could be in psychology, you could be in management, medical sciences, geography, wherever you did that course. I think we have to ensure that if we want to have better rounded social policy analysts, at the end of the day, come on, it's a social policy analyst. You're a social policy analyst. You are advocating for social policy to advance the cause of development, whether in terms of, you know, improved quality of systems delivery, promoting greater equity and justice and so on. But who are you doing it for? You're doing it for people. So you have to understand all facets of what makes these people tick and move and act. And I think, you know, there are so many latent dimensions of a demography curriculum that would bring home those kinds of sensibilities. So to answer Lionel's question, certainly yes. Epidemiology, I think, you know, again, epidemiology and demography operate hand in hand. Because I remembered when I was a PhD student, I read all the courses I could have read in demography in my department. But in this, the biostatistic, the Department of Biostatistics, there was a course offered in epidemiology. And I went and I did it. Well, I shouldn't say I did it. I audited it. Because I sensed that I could only be a better demographer if I have that sensibility to enhance my thinking as it relates to, you know, the study of mortality as a component that impacts demographic change and change in population size. And there's what you call, you know, the proximate determinants framework, and there's a proximate determinants framework in terms of explaining disease outcome and mortality that brings to bear in many ways, you know, and in a very holistic way, elements of epidemiology. In fact, there's a book chapter I contributed to recently on looking at, you know, the severity of COVID-19 in 19 Caribbean countries. And in writing that chapter, I did draw on epidemiology to a large extent because of the holistic engagement I have had with epidemiology as a sort of complementary element of demographic thought process. And I think it does fit in nicely, and it is something that the social science faculty in particular has to consider as it goes forward in terms of, you know, ensuring that we have as much as possible a consummate and comprehensive social scientists that we seek to produce.
All right. So, I mean, we all know, Dr. St. Bernard, that you can easily speak on these topics for hours and hours at a time, but I think we have worn out our welcome when we've gone a little past our proposed end time. So I want to take this opportunity now to start wrapping up the Spotlight series, this session with you, Dr. St. Bernard. And I want to start by giving, on behalf of all of the persons here, on behalf of the SALISES family, on behalf of all of your MSc students, past and present, and possibly even future, a great thank you for this presentation, but the work that you've done overall in championing the idea of demography as a science and integral to the population policy, to social policy, and to the development agenda. I think that your presentation today would have sparked interest amongst persons who are not necessarily a part of the field, and further solidifies the importance of a demographic sensitivity and a sociological imagination within population landscape. So thank you so much for your presentation. Thank you for always being willing to give us all the data that you can find, because we know it is so important to really understanding the importance of the role that demography plays within social policy. So thank you so much, Dr. St. Bernard. As we move into the thank yous, I want to also thank Professor Audrey Henry Lee, the first female SALISES director, for her opening remarks this morning. Thank you so much for being here and always championing SALISES. And just if your appetite has been whet, you should by Dr. St. Bernard's presentation, you should remember that Professor Lee also talked about SALISES short courses. There's so many ventures that SALISES undertakes, and this is the tip of the iceberg. The Spotlight series is just an opportunity to really get persons interested in the work that SALISES does. A special thank you to the Marketing and Communications Office of UWI for all of their technical support. They have been very diligent in the background, always helping SALISES and the wider university family to ensure that these sessions are put on at the most professional level. Thank you in particular to Josanne and Chelsea. To the wider SALISES family, Mona, Kayville, St. Augustine, who are here in the background, but particularly to Kathy Ann and the St. Augustine crew, so to speak. Thank you for always being the wonderful support team, especially for this Spotlight series. And I want to thank everybody for their questions. I noticed we had New York, we had St. Lucia, we had Trinidad, we had Barbados. We had a number of persons from across the region participating in today's discussion. And of course, your questions have amplified the presentation by really getting into the nitty-gritty of what's important here. So I thank you on behalf of SALISES St. Augustine for your time and for your energy and your expression. And we very much hope to see you all again at another one of the Spotlight series. Next week, as a matter of fact, there will be another SALISES webinar. So please look out for all of the information related to it. It will be on the 29th and it will be on statistics once again. So if your appetite has been whet by this, please come back again and enjoy all that SALISES and the SALISES family has had to present to you today. All right. Goodbye, everyone, and stay safe.